November 30th, 2024. A packed conference room inside the Pierce County Sheriff's Office in Tacoma, Washington, fell silent as Detective Sergeant Lindsay Kierkegaard stepped to the podium. Behind her, projected on a large screen, was a photograph from 1988. A young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, frozen forever at 18 years old. Next to that image was another photograph. A middle-aged man with unremarkable features, someone who could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker, anyone passing by unnoticed on a city street. "Today," Kierkegaard began, her voice steady but weighted with emotion, "we can finally tell the family of Tracy Whitney who killed her. The man responsible for Tracy's brutal murder in August 1988 has been identified through advanced DNA genetic genealogy as John Guillot Jr. He was a stranger. Tracy never knew him. She never had a chance to protect herself. And for 36 years, he believed he had gotten away with murder." The room erupted with questions. How was he identified? Where is he now? Will he face trial? But Detective Kierkegaard's next words brought a bitter reality crashing down. John Guillot Jr. died of cancer in January 2022, 8 months before we identified him as Tracy's killer. He will never face trial. He will never sit in a courtroom and hear Tracy's family tell him what he stole from them. But after 36 years of searching, Tracy Whitney finally has justice. Her family finally has answers. This is the story of Tracy Jean Whitney, an 18-year-old girl whose life was violently stolen on a summer night in 1988. It's the story of a family shattered by loss, of detectives who refused to give up, of technology that didn't exist when Tracy died, and of a killer who lived 34 more years believing his secret was safe. This is the story of how a single DNA sample, preserved for decades, finally spoke from beyond the grave and identified a monster who had been hiding in plain sight. But this is also a story about the thousands of cold cases still unsolved across America. Cases where families wait and hope and pray that someday, somehow, science will catch up to evil. Tracy Whitney's case took 36 years to solve. How many more are waiting? Before we dive into this haunting investigation, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This case spans nearly 4 decades, involves cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy that's revolutionizing cold case investigations, and raises difficult questions about justice delayed. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in Washington State where Tracy's story unfolded, or thousands of miles away, this case reminds us that every cold case represents a real person, a real family, and a life that mattered. Drop a comment below with your location. Let's build a community dedicated to never forgetting victims like Tracy Whitney. And if you're watching this late at night, like I was when I first researched this case, what time is it where you are? There's something about these stories that hits differently in the quiet hours, isn't there? Now, let's go back to August 1988, to a time when DNA forensics was still in its infancy, when genetic genealogy didn't exist, when a young woman's murder would launch an investigation that wouldn't be solved for more than 3 decades. August 27th, 1988, Federal Way, Washington. Tracy Jean Whitney was 18 years old and navigating the complicated landscape of young adulthood, the space between high school and whatever came next, between childhood and independence, between who you were and who you're becoming. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, a relationship that had ended, but left the messy emotional aftermath that teenage romances often do. On that Saturday evening, Tracy agreed to meet her ex-boyfriend at a Burger King in Federal Way, a city south of Seattle in King County. What was supposed to be a conversation, maybe closure, maybe reconciliation, maybe just two people trying to figure out how to move forward, turned into an argument. Witnesses at the Burger King that night would later tell police they saw Tracy and her ex-boyfriend fighting, voices raised, emotions high. And then Tracy left. She walked out of the Burger King sometime around 8 p.m., leaving her ex-boyfriend behind. Where she went next, nobody knows for certain. Did she intend to walk home? Was she planning to call someone for a ride? Did she accept a ride from someone she thought was helping her? These questions would haunt investigators for 36 years. What is known with terrible certainty is this. Less than 24 hours after Tracy walked out of that Burger King, she was dead. Tracy's last night alive remains largely a mystery. Investigators believe she encountered John Guillot Jr. sometime after leaving the Burger King. A chance meeting, a random intersection of two lives that should never have crossed. Guillot, who would have been in his 30s or 40s in 1988, likely approached Tracy under some pretense. Perhaps he offered her a ride. Perhaps he asked if she needed help. Perhaps he simply seized an opportunity when he saw a young woman alone and vulnerable. What happened next was an act of unspeakable violence. Tracy was abducted, sexually assaulted, strangled, and smothered to death. Her body was stripped of clothing and dumped in the Puyallup River, where it would drift to the place where the Puyallup and White Rivers meet near Sumner, Washington, approximately 12 miles east of Tacoma, in Pierce County. The morning of August 28, 1988, broke clear and warm across Pierce County. It should have been an ordinary Sunday morning for the fishermen who launched their boat onto the Puyallup River that day, hoping for a good catch, enjoying the late summer weather. Instead, they made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Floating in the river, at the confluence where the Puyallup and White Rivers merge, was the nude body of a young woman. She was face down in the water, her dark hair spreading out around her like a halo, her pale skin reflecting the early morning sun. The fishermen immediately called 911, their voices shaking as they tried to describe what they'd found. Pierce County Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes, securing the scene and calling for additional resources. By mid-morning, the riverbank was crowded with law enforcement, patrol deputies, detectives, evidence technicians, medical examiner personnel. What they found told a story of brutality that no one wanted to read. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. She had been in the water for several hours, though not long enough for significant decomposition. Her body showed obvious signs of trauma, blunt force injuries, marks around her neck consistent with strangulation, signs of sexual assault. This was not an accident. This was not a suicide. This was murder, and a particularly violent one. But who was she? She had no identification, no wallet, no jewelry, nothing that could tell investigators her name. She was, in the parlance of law enforcement, a Jane Doe, a victim without an identity, a person reduced to a case number and forensic measurements. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Dr. Emmanuel Luxina performed the examination, carefully documenting every injury, every piece of evidence. His findings were grim. The victim's cause of death was asphyxia, specifically asphyxia caused by strangulation and probable smothering. She had been strangled with enough force to leave clear ligature marks and bruising. She had also been smothered, likely with a hand over her mouth and nose, or with some other object pressed against her face. The combination had cut off her oxygen supply until her brain shut down, and her heart stopped beating. But strangulation and smothering weren't the only violence inflicted on this young woman. She had multiple blunt force injuries, defensive wounds on her hands and arms suggesting she'd tried to fight back, impact injuries to her head and body, indicating she'd been struck repeatedly. And the sexual assault evidence was unequivocal. This young woman had been raped before being killed, her body violated in death as it had been violated in life. Dr. Laxina collected evidence meticulously. He took DNA swabs from the victim's body, specifically from areas where the perpetrator's DNA might be present, trace evidence from the sexual assault, possible skin cells from the strangulation, any biological material that might identify the killer. In 1988, DNA analysis was still a relatively new forensic tool. The first DNA-based conviction in the United States had only occurred in 1987, less than a year before Tracy's murder. But investigators knew enough to preserve the evidence, to catalog it carefully, to store it properly. They knew that someday, maybe soon or maybe far in the future, science might advance enough to extract answers from those tiny biological samples. The victim's body was carefully examined for any other identifying features, scars, birthmarks, tattoos, anything that might help determine who she was. She was young, probably not more than 20 years old. She had dark brown hair, medium length. She stood approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed around 110 pounds. Petite. Delicate. Her hands showed no signs of hard labor. Her teeth were in relatively good condition, suggesting she'd had access to at least basic dental care. But none of these details immediately revealed her identity. Meanwhile, back at the scene where the body was found, evidence technicians combed the riverbank, looking for anything that might provide clues. The problem with a river as a dump site is that water destroys evidence. It washes away blood, fibers, fingerprints. It carries bodies downstream, sometimes for miles, making it difficult to determine where the victim actually entered the water. And it attracts scavengers, fish, birds, insects, that can alter or destroy forensic evidence. The location where the fishermen found the body was at the confluence of 2 rivers, a mixing point where currents converge. This meant the body could have entered the water from multiple upstream locations. Investigators would need to figure out where the murder actually occurred. Was the victim killed near where she was dumped? Was she killed elsewhere and transported to the river? Did she float downstream from another location? These questions would require careful analysis of river currents, water depth, temperature, and timing. But first, investigators needed to answer the most basic question. Who was this young woman? What time is it where you're watching? Are you staying up late following this investigation, just like the detectives who worked through that first night trying to identify Tracy Whitney? Hit that like button if you believe every victim deserves to have their name back. And drop a comment. Have you ever heard of a case where a victim went unidentified for a long time? It's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of cold case work, when a victim dies nameless. For 2 months, the young woman found in the Puyallup River remained a Jane Doe. Missing persons reports were checked and cross-referenced. Law enforcement agencies across Washington state and neighboring areas were contacted. Did anyone have a report of a young woman matching this description who had disappeared in late August? Photographs of the victim's face, taken post-mortem and carefully edited to be as dignified as possible, were circulated to police departments. Someone, somewhere, must be missing this girl, and someone was. Tracy Jean Whitney had been reported missing by her father shortly after she failed to come home on August 27, 1988. He had filed a missing persons report with Federal Way Police, describing his 18-year-old daughter, noting that she'd last been seen at a Burger King, arguing with her ex-boyfriend. The report was entered into state databases, but in 1988, Information sharing between different jurisdictions wasn't as seamless as it is today. Federal Way was in King County. The body had been found in Pierce County. The two agencies didn't immediately connect the cases. It wasn't until investigators began specifically looking at dental records that the connection was finally made. Tracy had been to a dentist within the past year, and those dental records were on file. When forensic odontologists compared the Jane Doe's teeth to Tracy Whitney's dental records, they found a match. In October 1988, 2 months after her body was found, the Jane Doe officially became Tracy Jean Whitney. She was 18 years old, born in 1970. She was a resident of Federal Way, living with her father. She had a younger sister named Robin, who was only 11 years old. She had extended family who loved her, uncles, aunts, cousins, who would remember her as someone who made people feel special. Someone who had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. Tracy's uncle, Chad Bartlett, was actually younger than Tracy by a few years. He would later recall that during family gatherings, Tracy always made time for him, always made him feel included. She had a way of making people feel special, Bartlett would tell reporters 36 years later, when Tracy's case was finally solved. When she was with me, I felt like she was my best friend. I just remember feeling happy. Some of the images fade, but the way people make you feel is what stays with you. But in October 1988, when Tracy was finally identified, her family's grief was compounded by the horrific details of her death. They learned that Tracy had been sexually assaulted, strangled, smothered, beaten, and dumped in a river like garbage. They learned that her final hours had been filled with terror and pain. They learned that someone out there, someone who might be walking past them on the street, sitting next to them at a traffic light, living a normal life, had done this to Tracy and gotten away with it. For Tracy's 11-year-old sister, Robin, the trauma was profound. Tracy had been her protector, her big sister, the person who made Robin feel safe. And now, Tracy was gone, taken in the most violent way imaginable. Robin made a decision that would shape the next 36 years of her life. She would never talk about Tracy. Not to her friends, not to her father, not even, eventually, to her own daughters. I didn't want to confront what had happened to her, the nature of her final moments, and how frightened she must have felt. Robin would later tell CNN, "I also had to grapple with all the experiences we missed as sisters, and how unjust that was." Robin believed the likelihood of the case being solved was slim. And dwelling on the what-ifs, what if Tracy had never gone to that Burger King? What if she'd gotten a different ride home? What if someone had intervened? Only brought renewed grief and frustration. So Robin locked Tracy away in a part of her heart that she never opened, never examined, never shared. It was the only way she knew how to survive. Meanwhile, detectives were launching what would become a 36-year investigation. Now that they knew the victim's name, they could begin the painstaking process of reconstructing Tracy's last hours. Who had she seen? Where had she gone? Who might have had an opportunity to abduct her? The investigation began with the most obvious suspects, people Tracy knew. Her ex-boyfriend, whom she'd argued with at the Burger King, was immediately brought in for questioning. Had the argument escalated? Had he followed Tracy when she left? The ex-boyfriend was cooperative, devastated by Tracy's death, and willing to submit to a polygraph examination. He passed. More importantly, when investigators collected a DNA sample from him, a simple cheek swab, and compared it to the DNA found on Tracy's body, it wasn't a match. The ex-boyfriend was not the killer. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find who had known Tracy. friends from school, former boyfriends, people who had seen her at the Burger King that night, co-workers from any jobs she'd held, family members. The interviews revealed a portrait of a young woman navigating the complexities of life at 18. Not perfect, not a saint, but a real person with hopes and dreams and struggles. And nothing in those interviews pointed to anyone who might have killed her. This was deeply frustrating for investigators. In most homicides, the victim knows their killer. Domestic violence, interpersonal conflicts, robberies gone wrong. These are the typical scenarios in murder cases. But Tracy's case was starting to look like something more rare and more disturbing. A stranger abduction and murder. If Tracy had been killed by someone she didn't know, the investigation became exponentially more difficult. There would be no obvious connection between victim and perpetrator, no shared history, no prior conflicts, no paper trail of interactions. The killer could be anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or, from the killer's perspective, the right place at the right time to find a vulnerable victim. Detectives also had to consider the possibility of a serial offender. Was Tracy the only victim? Had the same person killed before? Would they kill again? These questions were especially urgent given the nature of the crime. The sexual assault, the overkill, both strangulation and smothering, the dumping of the body in a river. These were hallmarks of a predatory offender, someone who might strike repeatedly. Investigators sent bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest asking if there were any similar unsolved cases. Young women sexually assaulted and murdered, bodies found in or near water, strangulation as cause of death. They received responses about various cases, but none seemed to definitively link to Tracy's murder. DNA technology in 1988 was too primitive to make cross-jurisdictional comparisons easily, and without a clear pattern or an identified suspect, the potential serial killer angle remained speculative. As 1988 turned into 1989, and 1989 turned into 1990, Tracy Whitney's case began to cool. Detectives had exhausted their leads. They had interviewed every known associate, investigated every potential suspect, followed every tip that came in. The DNA evidence from Tracy's body was carefully preserved, cataloged, and stored in the evidence room at the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, waiting for the day when technology might advance enough to extract new information from those tiny biological samples. But that day seemed a long way off. Part 3. The Cold Years. For 16 years, Tracy Whitney's murder remained unsolved. Her case file grew dustier in the archives. New detectives took over the cold case unit, reviewed the file, found no new leads, and moved on to other cases. Tracy's family learned to live with the absence of answers. Robin Whitney grew up, graduated high school, started her own family, all while carrying the unspoken grief of her sister's unsolved murder. Then, in 2005, something changed. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, had been expanding rapidly since its national implementation in 1998. CODIS is a database that allows law enforcement agencies across the United States to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes, convicted offenders, and missing persons. The idea is simple but powerful. If a criminal commits multiple crimes and leaves DNA evidence at different scenes, CODIS can link those crimes together. Or, if a criminal is later arrested for an unrelated offense and their DNA is added to the database, CODIS can match them to unsolved crimes. In 2005, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office decided to submit the DNA evidence from Tracy Whitney's case to CODIS. This was a significant step. It meant that Tracy's killer's DNA profile would be continuously compared against millions of other profiles in the system, searching for a match. If Tracy's killer was ever arrested and had their DNA swabbed, CODIS would ping. If the killer committed another crime and left DNA evidence, CODIS might connect the cases. The DNA was submitted. Detectives waited for the results with cautious hope. Maybe, finally, after 17 years, they would get a hit. Maybe Tracy's killer was already in the system, just waiting to be identified. But when the results came back, there was no match. Tracy's killer's DNA was not in CODIS. Either the killer had never been arrested for another crime, or they'd committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard procedure. Or they'd somehow avoided detection entirely. It was another dead end. For the next 17 years, from 2005 to 2022, Tracy Whitney's case remained in that frustrating category of cold but not forgotten. Detectives periodically reviewed the file, hoping for new leads or new technology. They reached out to Tracy's family on anniversaries of her death, assuring them that the case was still open, still being worked, still a priority. But the reality was that without a suspect and without a CODIS match, there was nowhere else to go. Tracy's family continued their private grief. Robin Whitney, now an adult with daughters of her own, still couldn't bring herself to talk about Tracy. The pain was too raw, too overwhelming. Robin had never even told her own daughters about Tracy, about the aunt they'd never known, about the tragedy that had shaped their mother's life. Robin worried that if she started talking about Tracy, she would have to confront the horror of what happened, the fear Tracy must have felt in her final moments, the injustice of a killer who had never been caught. But Robin held on to a faint hope. She kept up with advances in forensic science. She read news stories about cold cases being solved through DNA technology. She heard about the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, a case that had been cold for decades until investigators used a revolutionary new technique called forensic genetic genealogy to identify the suspect. Forensic genetic genealogy was a game changer. Instead of relying on CODIS to find a direct match to a DNA profile, genealogists could use public DNA databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA to find distant relatives of an unknown suspect. By building family trees and working forward through generations, genealogists could narrow down a list of potential suspects until they identified the most likely candidate. It was painstaking, time-consuming work that required both scientific expertise and genealogical research skills. But it worked. Case after case was being solved using this technique. Robin dared to hope that maybe, someday, forensic genetic genealogy might solve Tracy's case too. She didn't have to wait much longer. In 2022, the Washington State Attorney General's office announced a grant program specifically designed to fund forensic genetic genealogy for cold cases. The grant would cover the costs of sending DNA samples to specialized laboratories that could perform the advanced analysis required for genealogy work. And it would fund the genealogists who would build the family trees necessary to identify suspects. When Detective Sergeant Lindsay Kierkegaard learned about the grant, Tracy Whitney's case was one of the first she thought of. The DNA evidence was solid. It had been carefully preserved since 1988. The case had been unsolved for 34 years, despite multiple investigations and CODIS submissions. Tracy's family deserved answers. And with forensic genetic genealogy, there was finally a real chance of identifying the killer. Kierkegaard applied for the grant and was approved. In late 2022, the DNA evidence from Tracy Whitney's case was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. Parabon had worked on hundreds of cold cases across the United States, Using their proprietary snapshot DNA phenotyping technology and extensive genealogy databases to identify unknown suspects and victims. The first challenge was extracting a usable DNA profile from the 1988 evidence. DNA degrades over time, especially if it hasn't been stored under ideal conditions. The samples from Tracy's case were 34 years old. But Parabon's scientists had experience working with degraded DNA, and they were able to extract enough genetic material to build a comprehensive DNA profile. Not just the 13 core markers used in CODIS, but hundreds of thousands of markers that could be used for genealogy purposes. Once the DNA profile was complete, Parabon's genealogists got to work. They uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases, searching for matches to people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA for ancestry research. The goal was to find distant relatives of the suspect, third cousins, fourth cousins, even more distant connections, who could serve as anchors for building a family tree. The genealogy work was incredibly complex. Parabon's team traced the suspect's family lines back to the 1700s, identifying common ancestors, and then working forward through multiple generations to identify all of their descendants. The process involved combing through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, and family histories. Each branch of the family tree had to be carefully documented and verified. As the family tree grew, the pool of potential suspects began to narrow. The genealogists were looking for someone who matched the basic parameters. Male, based on the DNA profile. The right age to have committed the crime in 1988, and living in or near Washington State at the time of Tracy's murder. After months of painstaking work, the family tree pointed to one individual who fit all the criteria: John Guillot Jr. The name meant nothing to detectives. Guillot had never been a suspect in Tracy Whitney's case. There was no evidence that he had ever known Tracy or had any connection to her whatsoever. He had never been arrested in connection with her murder, and a check of his criminal history revealed no prior convictions for sexual assault or violent crimes that would have put him on investigators' radar. But the genealogy evidence was compelling. Guillot's family tree aligned perfectly with the DNA profile from Tracy's case. He was the right age, likely in his 30s or 40s in 1988. And critically, he had lived in Washington State in 1988, in an area that would have given him access to Federal Way and the surrounding regions where Tracy disappeared. There was just one problem. John Guillot Jr. was dead. He had died of cancer in January 2022, 8 months before Parabon identified him as the suspect in Tracy's murder. This was a devastating blow. After 36 years of waiting, after finally identifying Tracy's killer, detectives would never have the satisfaction of arresting him. They would never be able to interrogate him, to ask him why he killed Tracy, to hear him explain his actions. They would never see him stand trial, face Tracy's family in court, or be sentenced to prison. Justice in the traditional sense, arrest, prosecution, conviction, punishment, was impossible. But that didn't mean the investigation was over. Detectives still needed to confirm that Guillot was indeed Tracy's killer. Genealogy evidence, while powerful, isn't the same as a definitive DNA match. To prove beyond any doubt that Guillot was responsible, detectives needed to compare his actual DNA to the DNA from Tracy's murder. The problem was that Guillot's remains had been cremated after his death. There was no body to exhume, no tissue samples preserved by the medical examiner. Without Guillot's DNA, detectives couldn't make the final confirmation. But there was another option. Guillot's biological son, John Guillot III. Children inherit half of their DNA from each parent. If detectives could obtain a DNA sample from Guillot's son and compare it to the suspect DNA from Tracy's case, They could determine whether Guillot's son and the unknown suspect shared the expected parent-child relationship. If the genetic markers aligned in the right pattern, it would prove that John Guillot Jr. was Tracy's killer. Detectives reached out to Guillot's son. They explained the investigation, the DNA evidence, and what they needed. Guillot III had to process the shocking revelation that his father might have been a murderer, someone who had abducted, raped, strangled, and smothered an 18-year-old girl in 1988, and then lived with that secret for the rest of his life. Guillot III consented to DNA testing. A sample was collected and sent for analysis. The results came back with scientific certainty. John Guillot III was the biological son of the man whose DNA had been found on Tracy Whitney's body in 1988, which meant John Guillot Jr. was definitively Tracy Whitney's killer. After 36 years, Tracy's murder was solved. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment with your location, and let's honor Tracy Whitney's memory together. Whether you're in Washington, across the United States, or on the other side of the world, this case reminds us that justice can take decades, but it's never too late to find the truth. What's the weather like where you are today? As I researched this case, I kept thinking about how Tracy never got to see another season, never got to experience all the things we take for granted. We want to take through who was John Guillot Jr.? This question would haunt detectives and Tracy's family in the aftermath of the DNA identification. They had a name, a face, and genetic proof that this man had murdered Tracy. But they had no understanding of why. What had driven Guillot to commit such a brutal crime? Was Tracy his only victim, or had he killed before? What kind of person was he? The investigation into Guillot's background revealed a man who had lived a relatively unremarkable life on the surface. He worked ordinary jobs, had ordinary relationships, lived in ordinary communities. There was no indication that anyone who knew him suspected he was capable of murder. He wasn't known to law enforcement prior to Tracy's death. He had no criminal convictions for sexual assault, violent crimes, or any offenses that would have raised red flags. This was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Guillot wasn't some monster who looked like a predator. He was a seemingly normal person who managed to hide his capacity for extreme violence behind a facade of normalcy. He was the kind of person who could walk past you on the street, sit next to you on a bus, work in the same office building, and you would never know what he had done. Detectives believe Tracy Whitney's murder was a crime of opportunity. Guillot likely encountered Tracy by chance on the night of August 27, 1988, when she left the Burger King after arguing with her ex-boyfriend. Tracy may have been vulnerable, upset from the argument, possibly not thinking clearly about her safety, maybe accepting a ride from someone who seemed helpful. Guillot seized that opportunity. He abducted Tracy, took her to a location where he could assault her without being interrupted, raped her, and then killed her to eliminate the witness. This pattern, stranger abduction, sexual assault, murder, is consistent with predatory offenders who hunt for victims of opportunity. These are the most frightening criminals because they're unpredictable. They don't fit a specific profile. They can be any age, any background, any occupation. And they're often remarkably good at hiding in plain sight. The fact that Guillot had no prior convictions for sexual assault or violent crimes raised another troubling question. Was Tracy his first victim? Or had he simply not been caught before? Statistically, it's rare for someone to commit a murder as organized and brutal as Tracy's as their first violent crime. Many offenders escalate over time, starting with less serious offenses and building up to murder. Detectives tried to determine whether Guillot might have been connected to other unsolved cases. They looked at unsolved sexual assaults and murders in areas where Guillot had lived throughout his life. They checked databases for similar MOS, strangulation, smothering, bodies dumped in water. But without the ability to upload Guillot's DNA profile to CODIS, since he died before being identified, it was impossible to systematically compare his DNA to other unsolved cases. This was one of the most frustrating aspects of Guillot dying before being identified. If he had been arrested while alive, his DNA would have been entered into CODIS and compared against thousands of unsolved cases across the country. If he had committed other crimes and left DNA evidence, those cases might have been solved. Families of other victims might have gotten answers. But Guillot's death meant that opportunity was lost. His DNA profile couldn't be uploaded to CODIS because he had never been arrested or convicted of a crime. The genealogy evidence that identified him wasn't admissible in court and couldn't be used for database purposes. So if there were other victims, their cases would remain unsolved, unless investigators could find another way to link them to Guillot. Detective Kierkegaard made clear in public statements that the investigation into Guillot's background was ongoing. If anyone has information about John Guillot Jr., particularly about his whereabouts and activities in the 1980s, please come forward, Kierkegaard said. We believe there may be other victims who deserve justice. Robin Whitney, Tracy's younger sister, echoed this sentiment. After 36 years of silence, Robin finally felt able to talk about Tracy. The identification of Guillot had given Robin something she'd never had before: closure. Not the closure of seeing the killer punished in court, but the closure of knowing who had killed her sister and why. I hope identifying Guillot publicly helps solve other cold cases, Robin told reporters. I believe he may have committed multiple crimes during his life. If Tracy was his only victim, it would be surprising. People don't usually commit a crime this violent and organized as their first offense. Robin also spoke about what it meant to finally have answers after 36 years. For most of my life, I couldn't talk about Tracy. The pain was too overwhelming, and the not knowing was unbearable. But now, I can talk about her. I can remember the good times. I can tell my daughters about the aunt they never knew. And I can say her name without feeling like I'm going to break apart. For Tracy's uncle, Chad Bartlett, the resolution of the case brought mixed emotions. Relief that Tracy's killer had been identified. Anger that Guillot had died before facing justice. Gratitude to the detectives and scientists who never gave up. And profound sadness for all the years Tracy didn't get to live. Tracy would have been 54 years old now, Bartlett reflected. She could have had a career, a family, grandchildren. She had so much potential, and it was all stolen by a stranger who decided her life didn't matter. But Tracy did matter. She mattered to her family. She mattered to her friends. And this case proves that even decades later, victims are not forgotten. In 2004, Tracy Whitney's case represents a watershed moment in forensic science. A demonstration of how advances in DNA technology and genealogy research are revolutionizing cold case investigations. To understand how this case was solved, it's important to understand the science behind forensic genetic genealogy. Traditional DNA analysis, the kind used in criminal investigations since the late 1980s, relies on comparing specific genetic markers between two samples. In the United States, CODIS uses 13 core markers, later expanded to 20, that are compared between crime scene DNA and reference samples from suspects or databases. If enough markers match, you can definitively say two samples came from the same person or from close relatives. But CODIS has limitations. It only works if the suspect's DNA is already in the database, either because they've been arrested for a previous crime or because they voluntarily submitted a sample. If the suspect has never been arrested or hasn't voluntarily submitted DNA, CODIS will return no matches. That's what happened with Tracy Whitney's case in 2005. The killer's DNA wasn't in CODIS, so the search came up empty. Forensic genetic genealogy takes a different approach. Instead of looking for a direct match, it looks for distant relatives. The technique uses single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, tiny variations in DNA that are inherited from generation to generation. By analyzing hundreds of thousands of SNPs, scientists can determine how closely related two people are, even if they're separated by many generations. Here's how it worked in Tracy's case. First, Parabon Nanolabs extracted DNA from the 1988 evidence and created a comprehensive SNP profile. Not just 13 markers, but potentially 700,000 or more genetic markers that provide a much more detailed picture of the suspect's ancestry. Second, that SNP profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. These databases contain DNA profiles from millions of people who have submitted their DNA for ancestry testing through companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. The databases allow researchers to find people who share genetic segments with the uploaded profile. Third, Parabon's genealogists identified people in these databases who shared significant amounts of DNA with the suspect from Tracy's case. These weren't close relatives. They were typically third cousins, fourth cousins, or even more distant connections. But they were enough to get started. Fourth, the genealogists began building family trees for each of these DNA matches. They used public records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, census records, obituaries, newspaper articles, to trace family lines backward through multiple generations until they found common ancestors. Fifth, once common ancestors were identified, the genealogists worked forward through time, documenting every descendant of those ancestors. This created massive family trees that included hundreds or even thousands of individuals, spanning multiple generations. Sixth, the genealogists narrowed down the potential suspects by applying filters based on what was known about the case. The suspect was male, based on DNA analysis. The suspect was likely between 25 and 45 years old in 1988, based on typical offender demographics. The suspect had access to the Federal Way Sumner area of Washington in August 1988. As these filters were applied, the pool of potential suspects shrank. Finally, the genealogists identified John Guillot Jr. as the individual whose family tree, age, gender, and geographic location all aligned with the case parameters. Guillot was the most likely suspect based on the genealogy evidence, but genealogy evidence alone isn't proof. To confirm Guillot was the killer, detectives needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from him or a close relative and compare it to the crime scene DNA. Since Guillot was deceased and cremated, detectives turned to his biological son. The DNA test confirmed what the genealogy evidence suggested. Guillot was Tracy's killer. This multi-step process took months of work by scientists and genealogists. It required expertise in molecular biology, genetics, genealogy research, and criminal investigation. It required access to public databases and historical records. And it required funding, which is why the grant from the Washington State Attorney General's office was so crucial. The success of Tracy Whitney's case has broader implications for cold case investigations across the country. There are currently over 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States, many with DNA evidence that has never been fully analyzed or has been sitting in CODIS for years without a match. Forensic genetic genealogy offers hope that many of these cases could be solved, even decades after the crimes occurred. But the technique also raises important ethical and legal questions. Privacy advocates worry about the use of public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes, arguing that people who submit their DNA for ancestry testing don't expect their genetic information to be used in criminal investigations. There are also concerns about the accuracy of genealogy evidence and whether it's being used appropriately in court proceedings. These are legitimate concerns that society will need to address as forensic genetic genealogy becomes more common. But for Tracy Whitney's family, for the families of the Golden State Killer's victims, for the families of hundreds of other victims whose cases have been solved through this technique, the benefits are undeniable. After decades of uncertainty, they finally have answers. They finally know who destroyed their loved ones' lives. And they finally have a form of justice, even if it's not the justice they would have preferred. As Control who on November 30th, 2024, Detective Sergeant Lindsay Kierkegaard stood before the media and officially announced that Tracy Whitney's murder had been solved. The press conference was attended by local news outlets, true crime reporters, and representatives from victim advocacy organizations. But most importantly, it was attended by Tracy's family. Robin Whitney, now a woman in her 40s with daughters of her own, sat in the front row. Next to her was Chad Bartlett, Tracy's uncle, who had been just a young boy when Tracy was murdered. Other family members filled the remaining seats: cousins, extended relatives, people who had loved Tracy and had spent 36 years wondering if her killer would ever be found. Kierkegaard's announcement was carefully worded. Through forensic genetic genealogy, we have identified John Guillot Jr. as the person responsible for the August 1988 murder of Tracy Jean Whitney, she said. The DNA evidence is conclusive. Guillot's son consented to DNA testing, which confirmed that Guillot was Tracy's killer. Unfortunately, John Guillot Jr. died of cancer in January 2022, 8 months before we were able to identify him. He will never face trial for Tracy's murder. But, after 36 years, Tracy's family finally has answers. The room was silent as Kierkegaard continued. We believe this was a stranger abduction, rape, and murder. There is no evidence that Tracy knew John Guillot Jr. or that there was any prior connection between them. Tracy was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she encountered a predator. That predator is now deceased, but his name is known. His crime is documented. And Tracy Whitney is no longer an unsolved case. She is a solved case where justice was delayed, but not denied. After the formal announcement, Robin Whitney spoke to reporters. For the first time in 36 years, she publicly talked about her sister. Tracy was my protector, Robin said, her voice shaking with emotion. She made me feel safe. She made me feel special. When she died, I lost a part of myself, and for 36 years I couldn't talk about her, because the pain was too much, and the not knowing was unbearable. But now I know, Robin continued. I know who killed Tracy. I know his name. I know what he did. And even though he's dead and will never face punishment in court, there's a kind of justice in knowing. There's closure in being able to say, this man, John Guillot Jr., murdered my sister. The world knows what he did. He can't hide anymore. Robin also spoke about her hope that Tracy's case would help solve others. I believe John Guillot Jr. may have committed other crimes. If anyone has information about him, if you knew him in the 1980s, if you remember anything unusual about his behavior, if you have any suspicions about unsolved crimes that might be connected to him, please come forward. Other families deserve the answers we finally have. Chad Bartlett echoed Robin's sentiments. For 36 years, this family has carried the weight of not knowing, he said. Every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday, Tracy's absence was felt. And the question of who killed her hung over everything. Now we can remember Tracy without that shadow. We can celebrate her life instead of being consumed by her death. The press conference generated significant media attention. News outlets across the country ran stories about Tracy's case, highlighting both the tragedy of her murder and the breakthrough in forensic science that finally solved it. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to dissecting the investigation. Online communities that focus on cold cases celebrated another victory for forensic genetic genealogy. But beneath the celebration and media coverage, there remained a bittersweet reality. Guillot Jr. would never face earthly justice for what he did to Tracy Whitney. He would never sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence against him. He would never listen to victim impact statements from Tracy's family. He would never be sentenced to prison. He died believing his secret was safe. This is the frustrating reality of cold cases solved after the suspect has died. The families get answers, but they don't get the satisfaction of seeing the perpetrator held accountable. They don't get to look the killer in the eye and tell them what they stole. They don't get the closure that comes from a trial and conviction. Detective Kierkegaard acknowledged this in interviews following the press conference. Is this the ideal outcome? No, she said. The ideal outcome would have been identifying Guillot while he was alive, arresting him, prosecuting him, and getting a conviction. The ideal outcome would have been seeing him sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But we don't always get ideal outcomes in this work. What we do get is truth. And truth matters. Truth matters to the families. Truth matters to the community. And truth matters to the legacy of victims like Tracy Whitney. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate Guillot Jr.'s background, looking for any connections to other unsolved crimes. They've reached out to law enforcement agencies in areas where Guillot lived throughout his life, asking them to review their unsolved sexual assault and murder cases for potential links. They've encouraged anyone who knew Guillot in the 1980s to come forward with information. If Guillot killed Tracy, it's unlikely she was his only victim, Kierkegaard said. Predatory offenders often escalate over time. We're looking at other unsolved cases to see if there are connections. We're hoping that publicity around Tracy's case will generate leads that help us solve other cases. This is one of the silver linings in solving a case like Tracy's. Even though the killer is dead, the investigation can shed light on other crimes. Family members of other potential victims deserve answers too. And every solved case, even one where the perpetrator is deceased, is a victory for forensic science and a testament to the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up. Take a moment and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. This case took 36 years to solve, but it's a reminder that no case is ever truly cold when dedicated investigators and advanced science come together. Drop a comment. Do you think it's important to solve cases even when the suspect is deceased? For Tracy's family, knowing the truth was life-changing, even without a trial. What do you think? Tracy Jean Whitney's story doesn't end with the identification of her killer. In many ways, it's just beginning. Tracy's case has become a symbol of hope for families of cold case victims across the country. Proof that even decades after a crime, justice is still possible. The Washington State Attorney General's Office, which provided the grant that made Tracy's case resolution possible, has pointed to her case as an example of how to handle a case like hers. Example of why continued funding for forensic genetic genealogy is essential. There are thousands of unsolved murders in Washington state alone, many with preserved DNA evidence that could potentially be analyzed using modern techniques. Each of those cases represents a family living with uncertainty, grief, and the burden of unanswered questions. Tracy's case also highlights the importance of evidence preservation. The DNA samples collected in 1988 were carefully cataloged, properly stored, and maintained for 36 years. If those samples had been lost, contaminated, or degraded beyond recovery, Tracy's case would never have been solved. This underscores the need for law enforcement agencies to prioritize proper evidence storage and to maintain cold case files even when active investigation has stalled. Robin Whitney has become an advocate for cold case victims and their families. She has spoken publicly about the importance of never giving up hope, about the trauma of living with uncertainty, and about the healing that can come from finally getting answers. Robin's story, of a young girl who lost her sister, spent 36 years unable to talk about her, and finally found closure, resonates with thousands of other families who are still waiting for their own cases to be solved. If you're a family member of a cold case victim, don't give up, Robin said in an interview after the press conference. Science is advancing every day. Techniques that didn't exist 5 years ago are now solving cases. Keep pushing law enforcement to re-examine the evidence. Keep your loved one's name alive. And hold on to hope, because you never know when the breakthrough will come. Tracy's uncle, Chad Bartlett, has also become involved in victim advocacy work. He speaks at community events about violence prevention, about the lifelong impact of unsolved crimes on families, and about the importance of supporting law enforcement efforts to solve cold cases. Chad's memories of Tracy, of feeling special when she was around, of the happiness she brought to family gatherings, have become a way to honor her life, rather than focus solely on her death. Tracy was more than a victim, Bartlett emphasizes. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a niece, a friend. She had dreams and plans. She made people feel valued. And even though her life was cut short, her impact continues. Every time a family learns about Tracy's case and feels hope for their own situation, that's Tracy's legacy. Every time someone chooses to support cold case investigations, that's Tracy's legacy. Every time someone decides to speak up about violence or to prioritize safety, that's Tracy's legacy. The forensic genetic genealogy community has also celebrated Tracy's case as a success story. Companies like Parabon Nanolabs, which performed the DNA analysis and genealogy work that identified Guillot, regularly share updates about solved cases to demonstrate the power of this technology. Each solved case builds momentum for the field, attracting more funding, more expertise, and more attention to the potential of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. But Tracy's case also serves as a reminder of the thousands of cases that remain unsolved. For every Tracy Whitney whose case gets solved, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of other victims whose names remain unknown, or whose killers remain unidentified. The resources required to solve cold cases using forensic genetic genealogy are substantial. Each case can cost $10,000 to $50,000 or more when you factor in laboratory analysis, genealogy research, and follow-up investigation. Not every jurisdiction has access to these resources. Not every case has well-preserved DNA evidence. And not every killer has relatives who have submitted their DNA to public databases. These limitations mean that solving cold cases requires not just scientific advancement, but also social commitment. It requires communities to prioritize funding for forensic science. It requires law enforcement agencies to dedicate personnel to cold case units. It requires private citizens to support organizations that fund cold case investigations. And it requires a collective decision that seeking justice for victims, even decades after their deaths, is worth the effort and expense. Tracy Whitney's case suggests that this commitment is indeed worthwhile. After 36 years, her family has peace. Her killer has been identified, her story has been told, and in the process, countless other families have been given hope that their own loved ones' cases might someday be solved too. Tracy Jean Whitney was born in 1970. She grew up in Federal Way, Washington during the 1970s and 1980s, a time before cell phones, before GPS tracking, before the constant connectivity that defines modern life. She was 18 years old when she died, on the cusp of adulthood, full of potential and possibility. Tracy's life was ordinary in the best possible way. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't notable for any particular achievement. But she mattered to the people who knew her. She had a way of making people feel special, feel seen, feel valued. Her Uncle Chad remembered feeling like he was her best friend when she spent time with him. Her sister Robin remembered Tracy as her protector. These are the memories that define a life, not grand accomplishments or public recognition, but the quiet moments of kindness, the small gestures that make others feel loved. On August 27, 1988, Tracy had an argument with her ex-boyfriend at a Burger King in Federal Way. She left the restaurant upset, vulnerable, not thinking clearly about her safety. And she encountered Guillot Jr, a predator who saw an opportunity and seized it. What happened next was an act of senseless brutality that ended Tracy's life and shattered her family. For 36 years, Tracy's murder remained unsolved. Her family lived with uncertainty and grief. Her sister Robin couldn't even speak Tracy's name without feeling overwhelmed by pain. Tracy became a statistic, another cold case, another unsolved murder, another entry in a database of victims waiting for justice. But Tracy's story didn't end there. Dedicated detectives refused to give up on her case. Forensic scientists developed new technologies that made the impossible possible. Genealogists painstakingly built family trees that spanned centuries and connected distant relatives. A grant from the Washington State Attorney General's office provided the funding necessary to apply these advanced techniques. And Tracy's family, especially her sister Robin, held on to hope even when hope seemed futile. In November 2024, that hope was finally rewarded. Guillot Jr. was identified as Tracy's killer through forensic genetic genealogy. The case was solved. Tracy's family had answers. And Tracy herself, who had been frozen in time as an 18-year-old victim for 36 years, could finally be remembered as a person, not just a case number. Guillot Jr. died of cancer in January 2022, 8 months before being identified as Tracy's killer. He never faced trial. He never sat in a courtroom and heard the evidence against him. He never was sentenced to prison. He died believing his secret was safe. But his death doesn't diminish the importance of solving Tracy's case. Truth matters. Justice matters. And families deserve answers, even if traditional punishment isn't possible. Tracy Whitney's legacy is not her death. Her legacy is the hope she's given to thousands of other families who are still waiting for their loved ones' cases to be solved. Her legacy is the advancement of forensic genetic genealogy as a tool for cold case investigation. Her legacy is the reminder that every victim matters, every life has value, and no case is ever truly cold when people refuse to give up. If you made it to the end of this investigation with me, thank you for caring about Tracy Whitney's story. Hit that subscribe button for more cold case deep dives. Like this video if you believe every victim deserves both their name and justice. Share this video with anyone who might have information about unsolved cases or who believes in supporting cold case investigations. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? Do you have any memories or connections to Washington State in the 1980s? Do you have information about John Guillot Jr. that might help solve other cases? Your voice matters. Your information matters. And together, we can ensure that no victim is ever forgotten. Tracy Whitney, born 1970, died August 27, 1988, 18 years old, daughter, sister, niece, friend, someone who made people feel special, someone whose life mattered, someone whose murder took 36 years to solve, but was finally solved. Someone who will never be forgotten. We remember Tracy Whitney, and we will never stop fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes. With Unsolved.